right. Well, hey, man, I am looking forward to today's message. I want to give you a little recap kind of where we've been. We're in this series that we've been in for the whole month. I can't believe January is basically over after today. It's crazy. Not basically, factually, it's over after today. But we've been in this series that's really been more than a series. It's kind of been a theme for our year. It's been an identity, a filter in which we're walking through as a church. And it's the title of this series has been Slow Down to Catch Up. Slow down to catch up. And if you missed it, I want to give just a quick recap so we can kind of all be on the same page. Week one, we kind of talked about how our culture and our society has fallen into this perpetual state of being hurried and distracted. That everywhere we go, we find ourselves in a hurry and we find ourselves distracted. And we looked about this concept, and this idea I've used in so many ways, and for myself and for my family and for others, this idea that we've been looking at, that whatever our attention is on, it creates awareness for us. And awareness, you begin to see those things. And so whatever we put our attention on, all of a sudden there's an awareness of it. And so if our attention is constantly on the news or social media or what's the next show is on that, then that's what we are aware of. But when we allow ourselves to switch our attention to focus on other things, that can be what we are aware of in our daily lives. And so we know that we have to combat what is happening in our society and our culture, which is constantly trying to bring distractions and things that remove our attention from what we value and place it on other things. And so we talked about that in week one. Week two, we kind of talked about the history of technology and what that's produced and the speed and the pace of our life and how we continue to get busier and really the result of what has that done to our souls and how we're dealing with physical and spiritual and emotional issues as a result of the pace of the life which we were never intended to live in. Then week three, we kind of went a little further in that idea, and we talked about the fact that we have, as human beings, limitations. You and I have limitations. And as hard as for some of us, me, to admit that we have limitations, we have limitations. We cannot be all things to all people at all times. But that's okay. That's in those things we get to trust God, and He uses those things to direct our lives, to give purpose to our life, and to kind of put boundaries within what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. And then last weekend, we talked about how we are yoked to Christ, how He's invited us to apprenticeship from Him, and that He can carry the heavy burdens in our life, and how we can learn from Him the tools and the techniques to be able to shoulder our portion of life's burden. And that He is always doing the heavy lifting, but He is inviting us to grow. He's inviting us to improve. He's inviting us to get stronger. He's inviting us to learn from Him, to learn how He did it, to look at His life and allow His life to be the blueprint or the template of how we live. And so if you're here and you consider Destiny part of your Destiny Church, your family, and you're part of this church, if you missed any of those, I encourage you, go back, listen to them. They're going to encourage you. They're going to challenge you. And I think it'll help in this journey that we're on. And here's the thing, for the next several weeks, as we continue this series, we're going to be hyper-focused on the life of Jesus. And just as a general rule, Jesus, when we look at His life, and we look at those four Gospels, which are really, they're not stories, they're really almost like a biography of who Jesus is and his life. When we look at the life of Jesus, something that we can understand is that Jesus was never in a hurry. Even when death was on the line, Jesus was in a hurry. People came to, Jesus, your best friend Lazarus is dying. He's like, cool, I'm going to hang out here for 3 days, which doesn't seem like the friendliest thing to do. Jesus, my daughter's dying. Okay, cool, we'll slowly walk. And if anyone happens to talk to me between here and there, I'll make sure I have time for them. In fact, when we look at many of the miracles that Jesus actually performed, they were interruptions of what He was actually doing. He would be walking from a place to a very important place, and someone would be like, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus never once was like, you blind fool, I don't have time for you, I got stuff to do. He always had time. And it's because Jesus had something in His life that maybe we don't understand. He had margin. And margin can be defined as this. It's the space between our load and our limit. The space between our load, what we can carry, what we can do, and what we're carrying currently, and our limit. What then becomes impossible for us to do anymore. Jesus had space between his load and his limit, which is why he would go around and he would live and he would do things in this unrushed manner. And so when an interruption came, it wasn't like, you ruined my whole life. He had a pace of life. Like, just think about this. Jesus grew up, and for the first 30 years of his life, we know very little about his childhood. We have a few little stories, but we don't know much about it. But 30 years he comes, he gets baptized, God speaks from heaven, he goes and he preaches his first message, and then what's the very first thing he did? Like, after the first day on the job, he went and took 40 days in the wilderness after that, off. And you may say, no, John, he wasn't tempted for 40 days in the wilderness. He was tempted when he came out of the wilderness. You see, the time in the wilderness was when he was spending time with God, the Father. When he came out of the wilderness is when the enemy attacked him. See, in my mind, I always thought the wilderness was the place of weakness. He got you alone, and that's where Satan got you. But the reality is the wilderness was Jesus' place of strength. But that's why throughout the rest of his life, even after that, Jesus was constantly going to the wilderness, the quiet, the seclusion, the alone place. Because it was in that presence where he could reconnect and connect with his Father. It was in that place that he found rhythm. It was in that place that he created. And guess what? He had margin always. We have so many stories of when he would sleep in and he'd have to be woken up. We have stories where he stayed up all night praying. We have stories where he would be doing something very important and completely drop it because he had time. Most of us live with no margin. We find ourselves right up to the limit of what we can do. And if I'm being truthful about myself, most times I put more in my day than I actually can do. Like, I'm above capacity. I'm at overload. And let me tell you what that looks like. I'm at overload. I'm running my thing. I'm doing my life. I'm going to thing from task to task to task. And then one of my kids drops a bowl and breaks it. And then I lose it because I didn't have margin for this 2.5 minute distraction. I don't have margin for this. And so I'm rude to my kids. I'm rude to my wife. I'm rude to my dog because I had no capacity for this. It wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't even on purpose. But I had lived my life. I had placed my life in a place where when one thing derails, my whole day is ruined. My whole day is ruined. And so Jesus had margin. He practiced things regularly. He had routines. He had certain things that he did. He lived in a way that there was always space for his time with the Father, and there was always space for his Father's children. That is how he lived, like his daily things. And he invited us to have a lifestyle like that. He invited us to live in a way that we would have time to invest in our relationship with God, and that we would have time to be able to have opportunities to make an impact for people who both know God and who don't know God, to be encouraged by the goodness of the Father. But I found myself in such a busy place at times that I'm moving around because I'm doing so many things that are important, and I can even tell myself, but this is for the kingdom, this is for God. And I pass the person who's broken on the side of the street. It's like, too busy for you, I gotta keep going. God had something for me. Don't you know? And I miss it because I have no space. I didn't create anything in my day. I have nothing around my life that has allowed margin to exist. So therefore, I miss these opportunities. And so I actually have something for you. Maybe I need the ushers' help. The ushers are gonna pass something out real quick. And you'll get a bucket, you'll take it. And as they go out, because this is important. The question that we're asking ourselves is this. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, but the thing that we're called to, he said that we're supposed to follow him. We're supposed to be in partnership with him. We're supposed to use his life. So the question we get to ask ourselves is, how would Jesus live? And we can't just look at the Bible. I mean, the Bible is our template, because the reality is this. Jesus was a single 30 to 33-year-old Jewish boy who lived 2,000 years ago. And I'm pretty sure I can look across this whole room and none of us fell into that category. So we can't say, I'm going to live just like Jesus, because first of all, it's 2,000 years later. Second of all, we can't all live in the exact same lifestyle of who he is. But we can ask ourselves, how would Jesus live if he was me? How would Jesus live if he was a father of 4 and married to this amazing Colombian woman? Like, how would he live if he was me? How would he live if he was a single person right now? How would he live if he was a divorced person? How would he live if he was a widow or a widower? How would he live if he was me? But because we can do it, and maybe we can go old school with it, and some of you are getting it. Maybe we could ask ourselves this question that was really cool for a little while. what would Jesus do? And if you are old enough, you remember the What Would Jesus Do bracelet. That was so cool. But here's the thing. When I was a teenager, maybe this is just how it was marketed to teens, we had these What Would Jesus Do bracelets. But the way it was like marketed to me, the way it was told me is like, you wear this bracelet, and when you're about to do something bad, look at it and ask yourself, would Jesus do it? So I was like, oh man, I really want to have sex with my girlfriend, but what would Jesus do? I guess I won't do it. Oh man, I really want to get drunk right now, but what would Jesus do? I really want to go steal that car because I've been playing too much Grand Theft Auto, and for some reason it seems cool, but what would Jesus do? I guess I won't do it. It was like this guardian, it was like this thing, it was like almost like having your mom walk around and following you, it was just like this guilt trip, I really want to, but I'm not going to because I got the thing. I had friends who would take it off when they went to go do bad things and then put it back on later, because they just didn't want to deal with the guilt of it. I don't need that bracelet looking at me while I'm doing that. Put it on later. But I think we can ask ourselves a different question with this idea of what would Jesus do, not around these sins, these shortcomings, and that's fine. You can ask yourselves this, but maybe we can ask ourselves, what would Jesus do if he was me? What would Jesus do in his daily life that's actually proactive? Not reactive, not abhorring temptation. What would Jesus do if he was me? What would his life look like if he was me, the father of four, and his husband? What would he do if he was leading this church? What would his daily life look like? What would Jesus do? Would Jesus spend all that time on Instagram? Would Jesus spend all that time fighting about stuff on Facebook? Would Jesus spend all that time going through and binging on Netflix? Would Jesus spend, what would Jesus do? What were the practices that Jesus did to keep himself connected to the Father? Because though he was fully God, he was fully man, and he had a need to stay connected to his Father. So what would Jesus do if he was me? Maybe I can start asking this question and look at my life and say, Jesus, what would you do if you were me? How would you live if you were me? And you were faced with it. Because guess what? Jesus had a whole lot of things that weren't around then. But he can understand where you're at. He can talk to you and you can say, man, Jesus, what would you do right now? I'm trying to find this balance between living in this current world, but also not being of this world, that I'm called to live differently, that I'm not supposed to look like everyone else, that I'm supposed to be different, but I'm also supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be connected, but I'm supposed to be apart. How do I live this way, Jesus? Because it seems like they're impossible, and yet I know you can do it. I know you can do it. So what can I do? Jesus, what can I do? And listen, I know these are little silly examples. And I know for some of you, you're going to treasure this for the rest of your life. You'll have it. You'll give it to someone in your will. It's that important to you. And for some of you, I also know that you're going to throw it away on your way out. And that's okay. I forgive you in advance. And it'll only hurt my feelings just a little bit. And this is just a thing. This is something I want. What would Jesus do if he was me? Not to stop sinning. That's important. But what lifestyle would Jesus live? What would his daily life look like if he was me? I think there's something that's interesting. I think the first thing that Jesus would say is he'd probably say, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. You have too much. You have too much and you can't keep this pace. You need to slow down. Maybe not everyone, but I think a lot of us. He would say, you need to slow down. I love this quote from Stephen Covey. He says, we achieve inner peace when our schedule is aligned with our values. When our schedule is aligned with our values. There's a lot of talk in these self-help ideas and books about taking your list of values and priorities and then making your calendar around them and all this kind of tasks and stuff. And it's all well and good. But so many times, here's the issue. If I were to take us, and this is me included, and I were to say, hey, what's important? What are the top things? We would go through and list about things about our relationship with God and our family and our kids and our work. We would have these things that are priority. But then if we at the same time, in the next step, we said, well, let's look at your calendar and your weekly practices and what you're doing on a weekly basis, we would realize that we're dedicating very little to no time to the things that we consider to be the most important and what we value the most. We don't put any kind of prioritization in it. And maybe you're like me and you find yourself saying something well, man, when it fits in, I'll do it. But the problem is these things that are good for us, these things that produce good fruit in our life, many times they never just fit in, they take effort. There was a season that I kept saying, man, I'm going to work out whenever it fits in my day. Do you know how many times I worked out? Never. It never fit in my day because I could always come up with an excuse that was better than making myself sweaty and tired. Like if I don't put the value on it, then I miss it. And when we look at our relationship with God, like many of us here, if not all of us here, would say that is my most important thing in life. Like my relationship with him, I want him to talk to me. I want to grow in fruitfulness. This is important to me. And yet when we look at how we organize ourselves, when we look at what we do, there's nothing in it where we create space for God to actually encourage us, to speak to us, to grow with us, for us that we don't do it. And so all of a sudden our priorities don't line up with our values. And our calendar, our schedule doesn't line up with our values. And here's something, this modern idea of like trying to do this is something that has been around in church forever. Like for as long as the earliest churches recorded, there was this concept. And it's something I'm going to say, you're not going to like the word, because I don't like the word. But these early Christians, and there's a whole lot of history I don't have time to get into, they rallied around this concept of a rule of life. And now the second I just said rules, probably like 3/4 of the years, you're like, I'm out of here. I may not physically walk out, but I am mentally checked out because I hate rules. Don't worry, it's okay. There's 3 types of people in the world. There's people who they love rules so much because rules create the boundaries of the life that they live, and they are so thankful for those. In fact, a world without rules seems like chaos in which they could not exist. So there are rule people. Just love them. They're weird, but it's fine. Like, they like rules. Okay, they have this idea, and some of them they're here like, that's me, I'm a rule follower. And I love rules. It creates so much warmth in my heart. Just tell me what to do. Like, they exist. There's dozens of them. But then there's people who hate rules. And there's really 2 reasons they hate rules. One, there are people who hate rules because no matter what the circumstance is, they don't want anyone to tell them what to do or what not to do at any time ever, no matter what. Even if it's something they actually like doing. Like, they can be doing something and then it's like, cool, you're doing that? That's great. Now there's a rule, you have to do that. And it's like, I'm never doing it again. Ever. Under punishment of death, I will never do that thing again, even though I did it every day up to this point because I hate it and I don't follow rules. I'm a little bit like that sometimes. But I maybe fall into this other category. The other category is they hate rules because they're actually going to obey the rules out of obligation. Even if they don't agree with it, they're going to do it. I took a test one time and it came back and I felt like it read my soul. It was like, you follow clearly defined rules. And I was like, wow, I do follow clearly defined rules. And I make sure that they are very, very finely defined. Because if it's not, I will figure out how that rule does not apply anymore. Always, 100% of the time. When I left my high school, they had written so many new rules because of me, because I would look at the rule book over and over again, and I'd figure out how I could manipulate it so I didn't have to do something. Pastor Mike had to make a new rule in our youth leader handbook, which got transferred over to this youth group, which is still here today. It is in the rules because I read in the rules that said girls at camp had to wear a one-piece bathing suit, but there was no rule for boys. So I came to camp with a Speedo because there was no rule against it. You know what was in the rule book the next year? Boys were not allowed to wear Speedo or other spandex products, which is good he said other spandex products because my track singlet was coming the next year. And it was a one-piece. Like, I followed clearly defined rules, not because I wanted to, but because I will do it just to spite you. And then somehow in my sick mind, it's like, I'm winning. Do you see this? I'm following your rule and I'm winning. How do you like that? I'm broken. I'm just telling you the truth. Like, this is like the reality. But that's why. So we don't like rules. But I have good news for you. The rule we're talking about here is none of that. The rule we're talking about here, this word, this rule of life, it actually was used, it was a Latin word where it was first coined, and it was regula. And regula means a straight rod or stick, or it also can mean like a measuring stick. So it not only means this regula of life, it not only means this idea of a measurement in which we can see our life in, it actually has another picture that's really cool because the same word comes from a term that John 15 talks about a lot. if you ever go to a vineyard, you'll see that there's these vines that come up from the ground, and they grow up something that's man-made or man-placed. It's those poles. It's the thing that the vine grows up, and it's called a trellis. In Latin, they called the trellis the regula because it was the straight stick. It's the thing that the vine is supposed to grow around, and then the branches go over this. And so here's something that you need to know. A vine is supposed to grow around something. That's why when you go into the woods, you see vines growing around trees. Like they can't freestand. A grapevine, if it is just grown out of the dirt, if I just planted it and it just grows, it will not grow up and produce grapes unless it has something to crawl up. That's what vines need. If it stays in the dirt, it will either die or at best it will produce no grapes. That's what it'll do. But you introduce this trellis, and this trellis gives this vine something to latch onto, something to grow up, to produce fruitfulness. To produce fruitfulness. And the purpose of the trellis is not to make nice, neat rows. It's to maximize the harvest of grapes. So I want you to think about that. So when we read John 15, and he says this in verse 2, he cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit, so they will produce even more. The first thing I want to make sure we remember is this, and I've talked about this before, but maybe you weren't here. When it says he cuts off every branch, that's a really poor translation in the New Living. Because what it actually says, the word there is actually, it's not that it can't mean cut off, but if you look at the connotation, it actually means he raises up or ties up. And the reason I know that, if you want to know a little scriptural proof, and Matthew, our key verse, in Matthew 11:28, when he says, come to me, all you are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. The word there, take my yoke upon you, that take upon you is the same word. Do you think Jesus is inviting you to cut off his yoke? No, I don't think so. What he's inviting you to is to take it upon you, to raise it up. So when the Bible says that he takes up branches that aren't producing fruit, God, your master gardener, if you fall short and you are in the dirt represents the curse of the earth. If you fall short, it says he doesn't disown you. He doesn't get rid of you. His grace is bigger than that. He takes you, he lifts you up, he ties you up on a trellis so that you can be fruitful in your life. Because, let's remember why we're doing this. Verse 4 says of John 15, abide in me. Abide in me. Abide means remain, stay, rest in me. And I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. This idea is like we can abide in him. And the way that we can abide in him, we can see fruitfulness. There's this thing, there's this assist, there's this trellis that we grow on. And that our master gardener, the Father, is using to create fruitfulness. To create fruitfulness. There's this thing that we can do. I can organize, I can look at my life, and I can create ways in which there's a time and there is a place in which God can speak to me, and I can abide in him, and I can be recharged by him, and I can rest in him, and my values and the thing in my schedule can align in a way that I give God the space so that I can remain and abide in him. It's relationship. God is about a relationship. Here's the thing. We're going to talk about some other things and some practices that we can do and some time and the ways. But if the result of doing all these practices is not you abiding in a deeper relationship with God, then don't do it. Don't do it. If your daily Bible plan, the only thing you're getting is furthering your streak, but you're not abiding in God, don't do it. This is a means to an end, not a means in and of itself. These practices that we're going to talk about, they are not meant to be the thing that you're accomplishing. They are meant to be the avenue and the pathway that allows you to remain connected and abide in him and receive from him. And so if we do certain things just because we want to do those things, that's the very definition of legalism or religion. God's not interested in religion. He's interested in relationship. He wants you to abide in him because he wants you to be fruitful. I can wake up every day and I can put on my stuff and I can listen to this thing and I can do all this stuff and I can say, oh, look at my check. I checked it off. Done, God. Done with my God time. Done. And it produced no good thing in my life. So therefore, that wasn't anything that produces fruitfulness. That wasn't anything that produced abiding in me. That was just something that I did for me. And that's not what I'm called to. We're called to abide in him. And the reality is this. In this idea, I'm going to have to say no to some things to create an opportunity and time so I can spend time in relationship with God. It doesn't have to be 12 hours a day. It doesn't have to be my whole life. But I am going to have some time in which I can allow him to speak to me. I can't live on this life of like, if Jesus really wants to talk to me, he'll tell me sometime in the middle of my day or in the middle of while I'm watching YouTube videos or while I'm scrolling. He'll stop, he'll interrupt me. This is the all-powerful God of all. He'll interrupt me if he really wants to say something to me. And you know the good news for you is sometimes he will. Because he's that good. He loves you so much, sometimes he will interrupt your Netflix binge to tell you, we got to do something right now. He loves you that much. And then sometimes he's just waiting. He's waiting. We have to have this relationship. You know, I think about my relationship with my wife. Here's the thing. We need time together to grow, to stay connected. And if she came to me and said, hey, Jonathan, listen, basically, I want to talk to you every day for 30 minutes. I'd love to go on a date once a week and, you know, just make sure that we have some of the same plans. And I feel like that would keep us at a better place between the kids and everything. And if I said, oh, babe, I'm sorry, I just don't have time for that. 30 minutes a day? Are you kidding me? I don't have time for that. Once a week date? I don't have time for that. And you may be saying, like, that's the bare minimum of a relationship. And you're probably right. And the reality is, if I'm saying to my wife, hey, I don't have 30 minutes a day to talk to you, I'm too busy, and we can't go on a date because I got to think, the thing that I'm saying to my wife is, in reality, is like, hey, I don't have time to be married. I don't have time for it. Because relationships are not just like coexisting in the same place. They take time. Our relationship with God takes time. And many times, from our part, we give nothing and expect everything in return. And God's good enough to keep giving you everything every time you turn, but yet we just find ourselves in this desperation over and over again. And so here's the other thing. I want to read this. Romans 12, verse 1, it says, and so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly a way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. I love that. Don't copy the ways of this world. If you are living exactly like your unbelieving neighbor, then you are not living the same way that you should. If your life looks no different, if your schedule, and I don't mean like, oh, I'm not fornicating all over the place and I don't get drunk. I mean, if your day-to-day activity is like, he gets up and watches an hour of YouTube, I get up and watch an hour of YouTube. He gets up and he does that. Like if your life looks the same, listen, you are supposed to be in this world, but not of it. Your world should look different. Your life should look different. Not because you have to, but because you have a revelation of a God who loves you. And when you spend time with him, he will transform your mind to live in a way that is heavenly conscious as opposed to earthly conscious. He will transform you. He will change you. You don't actually have to do the changing. He will change you. But when you produce the space, when you're there, God will every time come in and says, let's do something different. Let's do something different. But if I find myself living the exact same way as an unbeliever, at some point I have to ask myself, how is the unbeliever going to think I'm doing anything different than him? Why would he want anything I have? He's like, you watch 3 hours of Netflix every night, and I watch 3 hours of Netflix every night. I guess we're on the spiritually the same level. There's this invitation to look differently. Ephesians says we're supposed to imitate God, imitate Jesus. And here's what we're going to talk about. and really for the next 4 weeks, another word that we're not gonna like. Because we already talked about rules. Thankfully, it's not the same thing we thought. But spiritual disciplines. I know, the rest of you just checked out right there. I hated the word spiritual disciplines growing up. I hated it because I thought it was this man-made, abusive situation. Because for me, a discipline is something that when you don't measure up, when you don't do right, you get punished. And this was now associated with my spirituality. So if I didn't pray enough, or I didn't wake up early enough, or I didn't read enough, or I didn't live good enough, I failed my spiritual disciplines, and now Daddy God is going to spank me. Because he's going to discipline me. He's going to discipline me. And in some of the churches I grew up, that's all it was. It was like, that is it. You either do this or not. And if you fail one time, well, you may as well just quit your life because you just ruined everything. God's goodness is not going to cover your shortcoming. And so I found myself like, well, I don't want to do any of those because if I do it, I'll fail. And if I fail, then God's going to be mad at me. So I might as well not do it at all. Then God's never disappointed in me. But that's this idea of discipline is not punishment. Really, we could think of it from an athletic perspective, the idea of like athletic disciplines. Maybe a word that will be a little easier for you to understand is spiritual practices. They're a practice, something that we get to practice in our lives. Because when we look at the life of Jesus, he did certain things and didn't do certain things. He put these practices, these disciplines, these things that he would do constantly. And in fact, in Matthew 7, verse 24, he said this, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice," not into perfection, who walks into these things, like a wise man who built his house on the rock. You put these into practices. And so we find ourselves at this place where God's calling us to look at our lives and to have a way of life in which we can allow certain things for God to do it. But these spiritual disciplines, like sometimes things like prayer and fasting and silence and solitude and like these ideas can seem like they're this like religious activity that don't produce anything except for a superiority complex. I'm here to tell you today that there's another way. That when Jesus said, "Follow me, look at my life, look at the rhythms and the pace of my life," we can look at Jesus' life and we can learn certain things that we can do that creates an opportunity in us to be able to abide in him, to remain in him, and to be fruitful. To remain in him and to be fruitful. And here's the thing. Here's the definition of a discipline, or a good definition of it. It says, a discipline is any activity I can do by direct effort that will eventually enable me to do that which I cannot do by direct effort. This is a natural discipline. Here's an example. I like to do this with staff all the time. I find something out that they can't do, that I know they're physically capable of doing, but they can't do it right now. And then we figure out a way that we can get them to do it. Like, for example, I sometimes go to some people on the staff and I say, "How many push-ups can you do?" And they say, "Well, I can't do any push-ups." I'm like, "You can't do any push-ups yet. You can do push-ups. You're capable of doing a push-up. You just can't do it right now." And so then we start a training program. Then we start a little regimen. You're like, "You're the worst boss ever." I know. And we start a little training. And by the end of this thing, with some effort, and with some discipline and with some practice, they can all of a sudden do push-ups. And like, I can do one push-up, and then it's 2 push-ups. This is this physical discipline. This is sports. You see it in athletics. It's practice. You start, you can't do it. You practice, you can do it. If you have a goal, you may not be able to do it now, but you can do it later if you work hard enough. Like, that is something that can happen. Like, that is something. But spiritual practices are different. There's still this idea of it's me accessing something that I can't do yet, but I want to be able to do. But as opposed to me relying on my willpower, which will fail me, my strength, it is allowing me to tap into the God of the universe, his Holy Spirit, who says, I will transform you into my image, who will encourage you and will empower you and will equip you to be the man or the woman that you're called to be, to live the lifestyle that you're supposed to, that I can access a power that is greater than my willpower, who says, the work I began in you, I will finish. I will complete that into the very final stages. Like, this is the idea of what we have when we take this time and we find ourselves rooted and invested into what God is doing inside of us. I'm accessing something that is greater than my willpower, because my willpower will fade and fail. Even the most disciplined people fall short, especially when they're called into something new. I find myself like, I have so much willpower. It's great. And that worked really good until God asked me to do something new. And then I found out I had no willpower. I only had willpower of the things I'd mastered. I only had willpower of the things I mastered. But God says this isn't a matter. Spiritual discipline is not a thing in which you rely on your own strength. It's a thing in which, yet another way in our life, we put our full reliance on the work that Jesus did for us, to allow him to abide in us while we abide in him, and to see his fruitfulness grow in our lives. And we're not talking about a legalistic practice. We're not talking about a ritual. We're talking about something that results in my life being changed. And I'll share this with you before we end. You know, a lot of these things, I've been on a journey. My wife and I, our family, we've been walking through a lot of these for over a year now in a different way or another. And there's something that I found myself that if I could talk to younger me, I would say this was never good, like this is never gonna happen. And I've been doing something, I can't even believe like I can say that I'm doing it, but 5 or 6 days out of the week, I wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to spend time with Jesus, to pray and to read my Bible. And I know you may be like, that's not that big a deal. If you knew me, like I would have told you that every person who woke up early to spend time with Jesus was a religious freak who was just doing it out of guilt of obligation. It's the only reason they were doing it. It's the only possible reason. And yet I was challenged in this thinking of like, spend some time. And I realized this is the only time on my day where I can find silence and solitude. Because if you know anything about my house, we have 4 boys. There's no silence and there's no solitude anywhere. Not even on the toilet. But all of a sudden I started waking up. And I changed some stuff, and I said no to certain things. Like I go to bed earlier. And all of a sudden I start spending this time with Jesus. And he speaks to me, and he organizes my day. And sometimes we just hang out together. And sometimes I read, and sometimes I plan, and sometimes I ask about the day, and sometimes it's sermon prep, and sometimes it's just abiding. And I've gotten to the point where when there's a day, because life will happen where something happens, and my dog throws up in the middle of the night, all this stuff, and I don't get to wake up as early, something happens, and I don't get to do it. The thing that happens is I don't feel guilty like I didn't do my religious duty today. I didn't do enough this morning. The only thing that I can tell you is I feel disappointed and disadvantaged that I didn't get to spend time with Jesus. And the good news is like, he's like, my grace is big enough to still be with you through this day. And you don't know how many times there's a day where life gets overwhelming and a moment gets overwhelming and the day becomes too heavy for me to bear. And I can stop for just a second and say, 5 a.m.'s coming tomorrow. I'll have that little time where I can abide with him, where he can speak to me, where he can restore me, where he can refresh me, where he can tell me what to do and what not to do, where he can look at my schedule and he can say, hey, I know you've got all this planned. Get rid of all of it. Just do this one thing. And I'm like, God, no, you don't know. That's not a very big task. I can do that really fast. Like, I got other things I need to do. And he said, no, the only thing you can handle is this one thing today, I promise. And you know how demoralizing it is when you're like, God, you only think I can do one thing? Like, I'm a big boy. Only to have that one thing become so large and bigger, and you think, Jesus, praise God, I got rid of everything else I was going to do today, because the only difference would be I still couldn't finish this one thing, and then I just would have failed at every other thing. and maybe 5 a.m. is not for you. I don't know what the thing is for you, but I'm telling you, I would have told you hell would freeze over before I did it. And yet, it is a thing that I treasure, that I value, that I organize my life around, that I change everything that I'm doing because I'm like, this produces fruitfulness in my life. This gives me time to abide with Jesus. This gives me what I need to take on this day. This gives me what I need to be a father, to be a husband, to be a friend, to be a pastor. This is what I need, and I look forward to it. And you know what the great news about it is? It's tomorrow's always just a few hours away. That 5 a.m. is just a few hours away. That rest, that sleep is sweet because I can think there's a lot of burdens. Jesus, we can figure it out at 5 a.m. tomorrow. So I'm going to rest up so that I can wake up and grab a cup of coffee and sit here and just be with you. And maybe you're like me and you went through some of this and you've tried it and you failed. Here's the thing I'd tell you. Jesus never hurt you. Religion maybe hurt you. Man maybe hurt you, maybe made you feel like you weren't good enough, weren't disciplined enough, weren't able to do it. They may all hurt you, but I'm telling you, Jesus and time with Jesus and abiding with him never hurts you. It's only good things for you. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes the thing he asks of you is hard, but even in the hard things, he says, but don't worry, I'll take care of it. You're not strong enough, but in your weakness, I'm strong. Just abide in me while I abide in you. Let's have some of these things that we can do, that we can organize our life. That's this trellis that can produce fruitfulness so that Jesus can be the center of everything that I do. I wish 5 a.m. would last forever. I wish 7 didn't roll around and I had to get school lunches and get packed and get going and get in the office and deal with people because all that is just things that take from me. And that 5 a.m. is the only thing that gives to me in the day. But he says that I'm supposed to be in this world, not of this world. I would be a person who's so heavenly focused, I'm no earthly good if I didn't realize that everything he's putting inside of me at 5 a.m. is so that at 7 a.m. I can start giving it back out because my fruitfulness is for others, not for me. I'm not supposed to admire my fruit. I'm supposed to share it. And so I just keep going to get recharged so that I can keep being the husband I'm supposed to be, or the father I'm supposed to be, or the leader I'm supposed to be, or the friend, or the stranger, or the different things, because that is who I'm called to. But no matter how overwhelming my day looks, I've got something tomorrow to look forward to. I've got a peace that can bring something so great. And just that knowing gives you the strength to take another step in today because you know tomorrow's not far away. That may not make any sense to you. Maybe you're not there. Maybe you're sitting here and like, I don't know. We'll talk about it. We'll keep talking about it. We'll keep walking through. And like I said, it may not be your thing. If the result is not fruitfulness, then stop. But I tell you, time with Jesus produces fruitfulness. How you connect, where you connect, when you connect, that's between you and him. But we're going to walk through in this next month. We're going to talk about these spiritual practices. We're going to look at ones in different ways. We're going to walk through it. We're going to find it. And we as a church are going to learn how to abide in the presence of God that will break every chain, every addiction, every sin, every fear off of your life. And I, for one, cannot wait to continue on this journey with you and see his faithfulness through every single step. Bow your heads with me this morning. Father God, today as we finish, and your Spirit is filling in all the gaps and the places that I missed. Lord, right now, I just pray for anyone who's here, who believes or don't believe, but that was hurt by religion, who was hurt by man, who was hurt by what was supposed to be a good thing, but was turned into a weight that was incapable of being bared. Lord, that you would break that chain of guilt or shame or failure off of us. That wound that you would heal. The thing that was meant for our good, but the enemy turned it into some kind of evil. Father God, I pray that you would restore it. So that our hearts and eyes would be open with wonder to walk into your presence, to practice what you call us to without the burden and weight of our past. But instead we can delight in you. Lord, we love you. Thank you that you love us so much. You sent Jesus so that we could have access to abiding in you. We love you, Father. It's in Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen and amen. And hey, last thought as we close, just because I think it's cool. You know, I talked about the two different rule haters. The ones who hate rules because you tell them the ones. All of the spiritual practices we're going to talk about in the month of February, and then spoiler alert, in March we're actually going to have a church-wide opportunity for us to walk out some of these in action. But all of these things, with the exception of prayer, which you could argue is not a spiritual practice, but an end result of abiding, Jesus never commanded any of them. He simply asked you to follow him. He knew that if he commanded it, some of you wouldn't do it just because you weren't going to do it because it was a rule. And he knew that if he commanded it, some of you would only do it because you had to do it. So he didn't tell you you had to do it. He said, follow me. Let me teach you. And you'll see the fruitfulness in your life. An invitation, not an obligation. That's the God that we serve. Hey, you're loved, you're prayed for, you're dismissed. Have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you next week.